Hello and welcome back to Critical Thinking, and we're here in Module 7, Writing to Speculate. Now, speculation is typically involving looking for causal relationships, and that is the essence of the slides we're going to look at today. Are cause and effect real things? Is there such a thing as a real cause and a real effect? So it sounds like something that we don't really think about in any detailed sort of way, but we should when we start thinking carefully and critically about those relationships that we kind of take for granted. So when we're talking about these kinds of questions, we're talking about causes and effects. A cause, factors in the plural or singular that contribute to an event or events that bring them about, and the effects are the events that result directly or especially indirectly from other events. So when we are thinking about these particular things, we're thinking about them usually uncritically. And so this is something I wish to kind of have you refrain from doing, because when we're thinking about causal effects, we need to be very careful that that relationship is in fact true and also provable. So there may be other reasons, other factors that are involved that we are either not seeing or we are willfully not seeing, because when we think about cause and effect relationships, there's a couple of things that are going on. In fact, three in particular. An event may have more than one cause, which is possible. An event may have various types of causes. And finally, the third one, determining causes with any degree of certainty, can sometimes be difficult, if not impossible. Now imagine considering these issues that I've just brought up, different causes, different types of causes, and proving that with any degree of probability. As a fire inspector, for example, looking at the burnt out hull of a building, a house, apartment, whatever, that's a tall order, right? You need to be really careful as to what you consider to be the cause of something. So again, that's what I want to look at here today. So when we think about causal relationships in any kind of an organized or critical kind of way, ever conscious of the difficulties and of this mental task, because really that's what we're doing. When we are speculating, when we're standing in front of that burned out building, we are speculating as to what happened. So we're thinking in terms of what likely occurred, but we're having to imagine all of these things. We're not seeing them played out in front of us. We don't see the direct relationship. We have to hypothesize it, right? We have to speculate it. And that's what we're talking about here today. So when we think about these causal relationships, we're using a critical thinking process called causal analysis. And so this module will look at these causal analyses, the various kinds that we can follow through, and especially the way in which we can establish causal relationships, or at least causal patterns. And that's kind of with experience and wisdom, the kind of thing that you're going to learn that becomes a little bit easier, but always willing to be critical. So causal patterns or causal types of thinking involve relating events in terms of the influence or affect they had on one another. So you look at a burned out hull of a house, you know clearly a fire's occurred, so some things are fairly factual, but now the difficulty starts to seep in. What was the cause or causes? Direct and indirect, different types of causes, a whole range of things are now going to be happening. Now, we can go day to day thinking about these things and really not putting a whole lot of thought into it. For example, since or because I was the last to leave, I turned off the lights. Okay, because I was the last one, I did this. Taking plenty of vitamin C really cured that terrible cold I had. So by taking something, it caused something else. So the cause of the sort of solution to the cold was taking vitamin C. Pretty straightforward. I accidentally toasted my hand along with the marshmallows by getting too near the campfire. Again, a pretty straightforward, provable hypothesis, right? My hand got too close to the fire, I got burnt. That's pretty straightforward. So what we are now thinking about is, in that causal analysis, finding the right way to describe that which we think has occurred. So much of our thinking centers on figuring out why something happened or how something actually came about. And of course, that's what we do every day. So when we are conducting causal analysis, which is what this is, we're allowing ourselves to make reasonable predictions, right? Because we can clarify those relationships. We can make predictions based on our thinking. That involves wisdom and experience and a fairly high degree of common sense, right? Because that's what you're kind of doing. You're applying common sense or reason and rationality to the evidence that you have, which are the effects, right? A burned out building. And now you're working backwards to the causal effects, knowing full well that there could be several and there could be different kinds, right? That's where it gets kind of difficult. So thinking carefully and skeptically, right? You're always thinking skeptically and critically, the what ifs, right? Those are always important. So we're thinking critically about causes and effects. That is a really excellent way to learn how to be critical and not accepting everything you see as either the gospel truth or a absolute 100% causal relationship. These are sometimes very complex problems. And so we need to be very careful when we kind of come down and decide that the following has occurred. Because we can talk about A causes and B causes, different causes that together work in just the right ratio, the right percentage to create something. So when we look at something, an event, an effect, for example, right? There's not just one cause of a resulting effect. There could be a whole string of causes. There could be causal contributing causes, interactive causes. And a good example is what we're talking about, fire. Now, when you look at this little diagram, as cute as Mr. Fire is, look at the different things. We have heat, which is, what is that? Well, it's a form of ignition. Could be a spark. Could be a motor suddenly kicking over. We had an explosion where I used to work at Kellogg's, which is where I am, kind of around the corner down the street. And we had an explosion in the mill when just the right amount of dust was in the air and a motor automatically kicked over because a probe had been triggered. A certain level had been reached. There was all dust in the air. In fact, what it turned out to be was a feed truck that had backed up, and the feed was not being dispensed properly, so it was collecting in the air. And then the probe kicked in, and of course it sent a signal to start the motor. The spark that caused the motor to start was the ignition. It was just enough heat to start that explosion. But when you think of fire, you've got heat, which is an ignition or igniter of some sort. There is fuel, whatever that may be, and there is oxygen. So those three things that together can create a fire are three fundamentally different types of causes. So this is what I mean. Something as simple as fire can have three distinct causes, not just one, but three of varying kinds and different percentages, that if we were to remove just one of them, that fire wouldn't start. You could have fuel and oxygen, but no igniter. Or you could have an ignition and oxygen, but nothing to combust, right? Any number of things could be happening. So when we're thinking about causal relationships, we're thinking of often more than one cause and more than one kind of cause as well. So that's what kind of really muddies the water, right? Kind of trips us up a little bit. Now, when we're thinking of a causal relationship, we're thinking of a causal chain in this case, a situation in which one thing leads to another and another over a period of time, such as the example that I just gave you about the explosion in our mill. And these explosions in mills are not just Kellogg's. They have happened around the world. Some of them have been deadly. There was one in, I believe, in England that caused the death of something like 76 people. I mean, this thing massively ruptured, blew apart, and killed people both within the mill and surrounding it. So those causal chains need to be always closely monitored. We need to make sure that those igniters are either protected or sealed in some way, that there is no fuel, in other words, dust in the air, and there is an oxygen. So that causal chain, if we know what it is, we can control it. But when you are there after the fact, you're having to kind of look around and figure out, well, what caused it, right? What were the things? But bottom line, there's always more than one cause for that same resulting effect, such as what I just showed you with fire. So we need to be really careful. And the answer that we present to someone, either to ourselves or in our report as to the cause of a fire, will really depend on our perspective of what we consider to have been, to have occurred in that situation. So we had causal causes, then with contributory causes, kind of secondary things, and those work at the same time, right, to produce an effect. This results in a situation which a number of different contributing causes bring something about. Now, in isolation, they may not be, very dangerous or really considered causes at all, but just the right ratio, the right percentage, just the right amount of each of those contributory causes, come together, and the end result is a fire or an explosion or something else of that matter. Now, interactive causes, along with contributory, these are influences or influenced by other factors. There are different factors that can relate to each other through kind of flowing back and forth. They are responding in some particular way. Again, let's use the example of the explosion at the mill. The fact that the feed truck was full, right? This feed truck, if you can imagine kind of an inverted a V-shaped vessel, right? So you have a large vessel that fills up with dust, and the system draws dust out of the air, and it lands in this large vessel that kind of comes to a point, and it has an airlock at the bottom of it. And just above the airlock is a probe. And that probe, once it's triggered because enough dust is collected, it starts up the airlock. And the airlock, of course, is run by a motor. Airlock starts up and drops that product, which is dust, into a feed truck. So what's happened here is no one's cleaned the feed truck. So it's now been doing its thing, right? So in all these interactive and contributory causes, well, the main one, if you could say what caused that problem, well, it was the ignition. Maybe. It was the dust. Yeah, it could be. But you know what actually caused that explosion? The feed truck. Well, why is that? Because the feed truck filled up. And it filled up in a cone shape right underneath the airlock. So every time the airlock ran, there was no room for the dust to go through the airlock and down into the tank. So because no one looked at it all day, the feed truck is what caused the explosion. And yet I've just finished telling you there is an ignition, there is oxygen, there is an accelerant of some sort. And yet if you really want to be sort of specific about it, it was that interactive thing. So it sat there doing what it's doing, collecting dust, but it just kept filling up and filling up and filling up, and finally filled right up to the airlock just below it. Airlock couldn't dispense anymore. So now that probe is going, and what happens? All of a sudden, boom, because that airlock kicks over again, because now that probe's been triggered, that becomes kind of the perfect storm. Right? When people talk about a perfect storm, they're really kind of talking about these kind of, these causal relationships. Now, we're talking about fire, but we could literally talk about any number of things. We could talk about historical events, right? The American Revolution. Well, what caused the American Revolution? Well, it's, no taxation without representation. People wanted to make sure that their money was being spoken for. Sure. No, it was the Boston Massacre. No, it was a French and Indian. It could be anything. So what we're saying is the cause of some historical event or a fire or anything else can be a whole range of interactive things, each of them quite different from the other, but together bring this sort of perfect storm into being. And the result is the effect that we talk about: fire, a revolution, or something else. So understanding biological systems, or political systems in this case, is very similar to understanding how any kind of a system will interact. Even the case of the mill. The system is such that someone checks that feed truck every couple of hours, making sure that it doesn't fill up. And if it does, they take it away, bring a new one in, and nothing happens. No explosion. But if you ignore it, there is a possibility that could happen. And for us, it did. We did have an explosion. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about two different kinds of things. There are sufficient conditions for something to happen, but we also need to have the necessary conditions for something to happen. So what are we talking about here? A necessary condition, right, is a factor that is required to bring about a certain result. The necessary condition is, for example, with a fire, oxygen, an accelerant, an igniter of some sort. but with an explosion, it could be other things. So a necessary condition is any single factor that is required to bring about a certain result. Now, something very tame, very simple, like a light bulb. A light bulb, it isn't just the fact that it needs electricity, although that is important, but it needs to be encased in a vessel. It needs to have spark. It needs to have all of the necessary ingredients that go into a light bulb, and a filament that isn't burnt out, of course. All those things are necessary to provide illumination. Any single one of them is not going to be enough. You could have electricity all going all through your house, but if all your light bulbs are burnt out, there's no light. So the light bulb has to be operational. You have to have electricity, of course, and the light bulb has to be of a certain kind. It cannot be mismatched with the ratio or at least the rating of the light bulb socket. You can't put let's say a 20 watts bulb in something that is 200, or the other way around, which would be a lot worse. All those things need to be necessary conditions. Now, what's a little trickier is what's called a sufficient cause. And a sufficient cause is a factor that by itself is sufficient for bringing about a certain result. Now, those things need to be there in order for something to be brought about. So the dust in the air was necessary for the explosion in the mill. I mean, you could have had, for example, the truck fill up and the airlock could have shut down. It's just not going to work anymore because it can't take anything away. Nothing's moving. So the sufficient cause, it may be there, but it needs to also have necessary conditions as well. It's enough, but it needs more. So the example here, having healthy nerves, being conscious of two necessary conditions for someone having the sensation of being pinched in the arm, or in the case of the guy with the marshmallows, burning, his hand. So for you to be able to feel pain or feel anything, you need to be conscious and be a sentient being, but also have healthy nerves. I knew a person one time who had nerve damage in their arm and could actually hold a lighter under his forearm and not feel it. Very weird, and you kind of freaked out when you saw it, but he said, no, I can't feel it. Okay, so the sufficient cause for the pain, which is nerves, wasn't there. So sufficient and necessary causes conditions need to work together. So this is kind of what it looks like if it were a diagram. Sufficient and necessary. Okay, A is a sufficient condition for B whenever the occurrence of A is it all that is necessary for the occurrence of B, versus B is a necessary condition for A whenever A cannot occur without the occurrence of B. So if A then B, hydrogen is a condition of water. If A then B, being a dog, is a condition of being an animal. Okay, so you have to be one in order to be the other. So when we're talking about necessary and sufficient conditions, there is some sort of interaction between these two, because by themselves they really kind of don't mean anything. So something that happens just before an event is an immediate cause. That can be any range of things. The case of the explosion, we'll keep going back to that one. What was the immediate cause? Okay, there was a bunch of necessary and sufficient conditions that I've just described. The feed truck that's full, the airlock that kicks over, the dust in the air as a result of it. But the immediate cause would have been the spark. It would have been that airlock starting up. Because these things operate automatically, the trigger is sent from the probe that says, okay, I have high enough level inside my bin. I'm going to start at the airlock to draw it out. So it comes out of this tank or out of this vessel and into the feed truck. So the immediate cause there was the spark. So depending on what's going on, it could be any number of things. So a factor that also helped to bring about the same event may have occurred further back in time is called a remote cause. So here, let's stick with the same one, sorry, because, hey, nothing sticks in your mind than seeing an explosion, trust me. Okay, so a factor that may have brought about an event could be a remote cause. So what was the remote cause there? It was the feed truck filling up. So we look at it and say, well, it's a remote cause. It could have gone on the floor. Yeah, that's true. at which point it may have taken a lot longer because, that little pyramid of dust could have spread out further, taken longer for that critical condition to be met. But because it's in a contained space, which is a feed truck, right, it's filled up and it caused the explosion sooner. So it was a kind of remote cause because it took a long time for that feed truck to get filled up. Typically, the feed person would go around and let's say they would go through the mill, and I would check, let's say if I remember there was 6 floors, the feed person would go through, let's say every 2 to 3 hours. So there would be lots of time for someone to check it out. Now, it happened in a morning, so the likelihood is the night shift person may have just gone to sleep. It happened. So a remote cause could have been, well, let's say the feed person on the night shift, because it happened around 10 a.m., the feed person on the night shift fell asleep, didn't check any of his tanks, or there was usually him, very few women that worked in the mill back then, but the feed person didn't check their tank. The day shift person comes in and may have not had a chance to get up. It was the top floor. There are many feed trucks as you work your way up. So depending on whether they're going to start from the top down or bottom up, regardless, by the time they got to it, now no one was killed in our case, but by the time they got to it, it was too late. So the remote cause could have been the feed person fell asleep on the night shift, right? So see what I'm doing? The more you think about it, the more the causal effects are very different. Could be the behavior of a person, the amount of dust in the air, an accelerant as simple as a motor kicking over, a feed truck that fills up. All those things are both immediate and remote causes. And when we think about them, we can see how they work together because it's almost like a kind of mobile. But we understand that those things all interact with one another and all caused to a certain degree. There was a percentage of these things that were there, but the end result is we were able to figure out what happened. So when someone finally put in the report, very likely he would have said, the person that should have been checking those tanks didn't, or the last person that should have caught that didn't. Now, no one was fired. We learned a lot. We safetied a lot of the mill and other buildings. For example, I remember they reinstalled they were called are called explosion-proof doors, and these are doors that are bolted with chains, very heavy chains, and the screw that holds a chain into the wall is about a foot long, and it is cemented into place. So these explosion-proof doors would literally absorb the impact of an explosion. It would blow out, right, about a foot or so, but would absorb the impact. So the doors would blow 300 yards like they did the first time, but they were actually safetied in. So we learned a lot. But we need to be careful when we're working on a particular field or in the field, and we're trying to figure out the cause of an explosion or fire. We need to be very careful that we're not making unsound arguments, or we're dealing with fallacies. And so we're back to kind of that rhetoric that we were talking about, the kind of logical fallacies. So in this case, there are some issues that we need to consider. There's 4 of them. One is questionable causes, like kind of iffy. An explosion is not caused by someone with the wrong, born under the wrong sign. I hope not. Misidentification of the causes, that could also happen. Or what's called in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means in the very fancy for after that, or therefore, or because of that. And that is kind of looking at 2 things that happened one after the other and assigning a relationship to them when in fact there isn't. Or the ever popular slippery slope, it's always there. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these. So the first one is a questionable cause, and as you can imagine, it is just that. It's questionable. Someone can present a causal relationship of which there's no real evidence. Let's think back a couple of months ago to the American election, right? That Trump went on and on about, there was fraud. There was no real evidence, but he thought that the reason why he lost the race was because of voter fraud. So, questionable cause? Oh, absolutely. because there has been literally no evidence that indicates that there was fraud of any significant degree, the degree to which it would have meant the difference between him winning or losing. Maybe a couple hundred votes here and there, but nothing to the tune of 7 or 8 million that he lost by. So a questionable cause is something that there's no real evidence to prove that this is in fact what has happened. So if that's the case, and of course we can think of all kinds of things. People believe in astrology and horoscope, lottery numbers, that come to us in dreams. If we spend money, if we go shopping, somehow things are a little bit better. Or somehow this idea that movies with the highest box office numbers are somehow artistically or critically the best movies. No, the jury's out on that. So those are questionable causes. Those are ways of looking at things that, it's hard to prove. Literally, it's hard to prove. That's why they're questionable. Another one is misidentification. So here we're not certain about what is causing what or what the effect is. There's a bunch of different things. If you are suffering from headaches and tension, which one is causing what? Failure in school and personal problems. The anxiety is causing the failure in school, which is causing the anxiety. Shyness or lack of confidence, right? It's hard to tell which is the one that causes the other. Substance abuse, emotional difficulties, all of those are causes and effects that are literally interchangeable. So we're kind of misidentifying the cause. It can happen. But when you look at these, you go, yeah, the shyness or the lack of confidence, it could be both the cause or the effect. So we need to be very careful, right, when we are deciding what is the cause and what is the effect. If we fail to recognize the fact that, there is that perhaps a third thing that we didn't know about, that thing needs to be also considered. So we need to always make sure we have our evidence, right? Collect all the evidence you can find, because that third factor between cause and effect, as clear as it may be, there could be that third factor that now kind of muddies the water and says, not so fast, right? There's something else that's going on here. So there could always be a third factor, or perhaps even a fourth, right, that is going to kind of problematize, right, render that causal effect rather difficult. So there's a fallacy of assuming a common cause. So, as I mentioned, even fire, there isn't a common cause, singular. There are several things that work, together in just the right percentage for a fire to occur, or for that matter, an explosion. There could be a whole range of things that are occurring for that to happen. Now this, the post hoc ergo propter hoc, that will never be in the test, don't worry. But it is a translation of after that, therefore, because of this or that. We're thinking that, these two things, this happened and then that happened. And, as a result, I'm sure there was, a relationship. Well, that's not the way it works. Those two things may have followed one another, but there's no correlation between them. And if you look here, the example, at 8 o'clock, I went to the bathroom. At 8:05, it started to rain. Therefore, my going to the bathroom, my urination caused the rain. Well, no, no, I don't think so. Unless you're up on the roof, no. So there are two situations or two things that may have occurred, but they are not considered causes just because one happened after the other. That's what this means. Just because one followed the other in a temporal relationship doesn't mean that there is a relationship. They simply happened one after the other. End of discussion. So that kind of mistaken thinking really leads to kind of superstitious beliefs of all sorts, relying on horoscopes and astrology, or in this case, wearing your favorite, jersey for your team. And if you wear it, your team seems to win more often. Sure, okay. But what if all of a sudden one day you wore it and they didn't win? Oh my God, that's got to be something else. So let's be very careful when we start making those kinds of, accusations or hypotheses or speculations, right? Because we're not sure. Now, the last one is the slippery slope. We all know what that's about. We're thinking about one undesirable action that somehow inevitably will lead to a far worse action. And it just goes on and on. But slippery slope, as we've mentioned many times, is unprovable. It's simply words. It's simply a hypothesis or a speculation, and a very bad one too, because there is no evidence to support that far worst action. Sure, A has occurred, but that doesn't automatically mean that B, C, and D are going to occur. Just simply that A occurred. That's whatever A may be. But it's just a slippery slope to say, well, because this happened, of course, it's going to lead to far worse. No, that's not the case. It just won't happen. So, slippery slopes, these kinds of things, if you get behind your credit card payments, then sure, maybe your credit card's going to be canceled, or you won't be able to buy anything more. At the very least, your credit score is going to tank. If you fail that first test, well, then you may be kicked out of the course. Your GPA is going to suffer. Any number of things. So a slippery slope. If one thing happens, and you really, after the word "then," can fill in anything. If I get behind my credit card payments, then the rapture will happen. Well, no, maybe you want it to, but no, it's not going to happen. Or if I eat, Doritos, I'm going to be paying for it tomorrow in the bathroom. Maybe not, right? We don't know. So those things are typically what are called slippery slopes, because there is no provable way to show a causal relationship between the two of them. So let's take a quick look at all of these one more time. Questionable cause, presenting a causal relationship for which there's no real evidence. All right, voter fraud, there wasn't any. Misidentification of causes, uncertainty as to what the cause is or what the effect is. We're ignoring a common cause, assuming a false common cause. We don't know that a headache is the result of tension or tension the result of headache. All these kinds of things. It's difficult to identify one or the other in any significant way. The after that or therefore, right, the Latin, assuming a causal relationship between situations that happened one after the other, fairly close together. But there's no real relationship. They just happened one after the other. Or the famous slippery slope, asserting or assuming that one undesirable action is going to lead to something far worse down the proverbial slippery slope when there is no proof that that's going to happen. Okay, when we're making causal claims, for example, people use causal reasoning because they want to see a cause and effect relationship that they think exists, right? Back to Trump, thinking that he lost the election because of voter fraud. No, you lost the election because people hate you, man. Thank God. 8 million people, 8 million more people. Now, the really terrifying thing about that was that it was only 8 million votes. He still got 71 or 72 million votes. There just happened to be more on the other side. So over 70 million people thought this guy did just fine. So kind of scary to think about. I digress. So causal claims, that's when you're making a claim that you need to be able to prove, right? It can be misidentification. It could be the slippery slope. It could be, being unable to prove it. So that causal claim, you need to be really, really careful. But if you are really wacky and you're looking, just about everywhere for cause and effect, here's one you can consider. That did you know the number of people who drown by falling into swimming pools correlates with the number of movies Nicolas Cage appears in? Isn't that amazing? Yeah, sure. Okay. Please begin laughing. I can hear you. Yes. Okay, you're laughing. It's stupid. But yeah, as one goes up, right, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. But there isn't a relationship between the two of them. There isn't. Or my other favorite here, the amount of honey being produced by bees and bee colonies in the U.S. somehow is disproportionate to the number of juveniles arrested for the possession of marijuana. Who would have thought that those two things match up? Yeah, if you believe that, listen, I got a little tinfoil hat I'd like to sell you. I know I'm being facetious, but the point is, just because there appears to be a relationship between these two things, be very careful, because often there isn't. So we need to always understand exactly what that relationship is. So causal analyses range from rigorous scientific studies that can establish those causes with some fair degree of certainty, to the opposite, which is theorizing, hypothesizing about the events that have occurred, whether it's in our personal lives or things we think have occurred. But in the case of your job as a fire inspector, it's a bit more serious, right? You need to be able to do this to an almost scientific degree. Now, all of a sudden, I've come along and said, well, there's secondary causes, sufficient causes, necessary causes, causal chains, misidentification. There's a whole lot of stuff to think about that when you are doing this, you need to be very careful that you're identifying clearly what is a cause and what is an effect. And once we identify that, it does make establishing a relationship to some degree of scientific, validity somewhat easier. But you always have to remember that sometimes you may not be able to find the cause 100%. There could be a series of different causes, not only more than one, but different types of causes. It does occur. So when we're talking about causal relationships, we are talking about the kind of thing you could actually conduct in a lab and prove, or those that we research with what others have said about a particular event, and then we report what they've found. So when you are writing a case study, for example, or a case report in school, you're doing more of the second one, right? You're looking at what research has been done by other people, and you relate to us what they have said. And that's good because it does help you to formulate ideas of your own, or at least use those ideas and comparatively apply them to a situation that you believe is adequate. So you're either going to be doing the work yourself in a lab or relying on others. So that's typically how you learn about causal relationships. But ultimately, in your field, in your job, you're going to have to learn how to do this on your own and separate out cause and effect, necessary, sufficient, misidentification, the slippery slope, something you cannot prove. All those things will factor into your ability to think critically as to what has occurred in front of you, whether it's an explosion or it's a fire. Okay, so that's essentially it. Kind of a deep dive into causal relationships, but I wanted to point out to you some of the difficulties in doing this in an uncritical manner, because essentially that's what I've done, is I've shown you that if you do it uncritically, it doesn't take long to run into problems. Really, it doesn't. So if you do it critically and accurately and correctly and scientifically, the likelihood is that you're not going to fall into these traps where you're not able to distinguish cause from effect, for necessary from sufficient. All these kinds of things do matter, but with time, with experience and wisdom, you will be able to do it better and better. Okay, so that's that. We're going to meet again on Thursday. That'll be the last time we meet before the break next week, at which point we won't have a class, a Zoom meeting, or even a module. So we're going to finish up here. We'll see each other on Thursday. And